From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Issue 1. Is Al-Qaeda back?
Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, known as ACAP, has taken responsibility for the deadly terrorist rampage last week in Paris. The death toll in that murder spree was 17. The 10 journalists of satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, 3 French police officers, 4 hostages. 2 of the Islamic terrorists, Saeed and Sharif Kouachi, joined ACAP during previous travels to Yemen. Also this week, ACAP released instructions on how to make a new, difficult-to-detect explosive and urged followers to use bombs aboard U.S. airliners. Al-Qaeda appears to have financed the Kouachi brothers with $20,000 to assassinate the editors and cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo. French investigators suspect that their spree was not intended to end in a shootout at a printing plant near Charles de Gaulle Airport, but with a shoot-down of an airliner using grenade launchers the terrorists possessed but never fired despite several gunfights with police. Last Sunday, 3.7 million people rallied in cities across France to support freedom of speech and show solidarity. In Paris, more than 40 world leaders, including the UK's David Cameron, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, and Palestinian Authority Mahmoud Abbas, attended a march of some 1.6 million Parisians. Conspicuously absent, any American official higher than the ambassador, an oversight the White House now says was a mistake.
Some have asked whether or not the United States should have sent someone with a higher profile than the ambassador to France. And I think it's fair to say that we should have sent someone with a higher profile to be there.
And the threat continues. Now Belgium. SWAT teams in Belgium launched a dozen raids, arresting 15 suspected jihadists at one location. 2 suspects were killed after they fired on police. The Belgian government says some of the suspects had recently returned from Syria and were planning to kill police officers. They may have been directed by ISIS. Question: is Europe entering a new age of terror? Pat Buchanan.
I'm afraid it is, John, and one of the reasons is the huge success of this purposeful attack on Charlie Hebdo, where they went in and massacred the target they wanted to kill. They came out, escaped, a dramatic exit, military style. They captured the attention of the whole world for 2 days, and they went out in a blaze of glory, being shot at. And what this is going to do, it's going to have 2 effects. One is it's going to have a copycat effect on Islamists in Europe who will say, this is the way I can really reach the whole world's attention. And I think Al-Qaeda and the other folks in Syria and Iraq are going to tell the Europeans who are coming in, stay home and carry out those kinds of attacks that can bring the entire world or 40 world leaders to Paris. So it was a dramatic, horrible event, but I hate to say it, was a military success.
Elena.
Well, Europe right now is ground zero in a war over branding between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Each wants to be seen as the leader of the world jihad movement. They're trying to see who can be more outrageous. It's not at all clear that the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is claiming credit for the Paris attack, it's not at all clear they really directed it. One of the attackers had been in Yemen 5 years ago, so he waited 5 years. It's a little dubious, but the point is they are vying for the honor of being the worst terrorists on the planet and associating themselves with the Paris attacks, which got worldwide notice, is a big feather in one of their caps. So I mean, this is going to continue, especially because of the easy access to Syria and people fighting there and coming back and with some military skills.
Should President Obama or Vice President Biden have been at the Paris event?
Yeah, I absolutely think they should have been, and I think it's quite extraordinary that they didn't think of that. Looking at both their schedules, they didn't appear to have anything going on in like a major national security priority that was going on beyond the public eye. So it was important, and I think the real reason it was important was to show that America stands with our values. The most important value is freedom of speech, and we weren't there, and it was visible that we weren't there. And I think just as the Syria thing in 2013, August 2013, with Assad and the chemical weapons, really took a big hit on American credibility, this has put a big hit on American value credibility. And look, perception in the world is important, very important, because it generates how people interact with us, for good or bad.
The president was on television on Friday. Did he allude to any of this, and were you satisfied with what he said?
Well, in the president's remarks with Prime Minister David Cameron on Friday, I think he was focusing more on cybersecurity. But I think the White House recognizes that they made a pretty significant mistake. And look, John Kerry has been in Paris, I think today, with a little concert going on, which was slightly odd. But it's a mistake. And you know, look, people pay attention to this. It does not reflect solidarity either with values or an important ally to be absent.
The White House staff did not even suggest sending anybody except the ambassador there. You know, can you contribute to anything about her and whether or not she was some kind of an effective substitute?
There's no way she could have been, or any ambassador could have been, an effective substitute for the leadership of this country not to have appeared there. It really is extraordinary how they could not have missed the importance of all of this, certainly for all of Europe. And I think the astonishing thing, I don't even know if they thought it was important, or believed it was important, or believed they were important in this context. And it was a huge blow. And it once again reflects, it seems to me, some lack of understanding of what the role of the United States is in the world, where we are faced with a hugely dangerous...
Well, they underestimated the power of that millions of people turning out in Paris, and the White House said they made a mistake. I think not having the president there is understandable. The security is of a totally different level for a U.S. president. Maybe Biden should have been there, Kerry. It was a mistake. But it's much more divisive here among the pundit class than it is in France. The Parisians certainly know that the U.S. is standing side by side. You don't hear any of this kind of grumbling that you just heard on this set. You don't hear that if you listen to any of the reports out of Europe.
Well, in the event of that, Eleanor, let's try this. Okay, an American plot.
Foiled. A terror plot against the U.S. Capitol. Federal authorities on Wednesday arrested 20-year-old Christopher Lee Cornell outside a gun range in Cincinnati, Ohio. Cornell allegedly had just purchased 2 semi-automatic weapons and 600 rounds of ammunition to, quote-unquote, kill employees and officers working in and around the U.S. Capitol. Cornell also had studied how to build pipe bombs. He's been on the FBI's radar since last summer, when he began posting messages and videos on the internet that expressed support for ISIS, the Islamic State. Cornell used the Twitter name Rahel Marus Ubaida. He sent a message to an FBI informant in August that stated, quote, "We should just wage jihad under our own orders and plan attacks," unquote. Investigators do not believe Cornell had any formal ties with ISIS or with other overseas radical Islamic groups. In other words, Cornell was acting alone.
Question: Cornell proposed to carry out attacks on Congress as early as next week. Was it his plan to disrupt the State of the Union address? Pat?
No, John, I think there's a real possibility here of a measure of entrapment.
Right.
The FBI captured some character, turned him, and they got some emails or something from this guy, and he went and they worked out for 6 months until they could get him to think up something, and then they arrest him. But John, there's a very serious point here about this Charlie Hebdo thing that people haven't mentioned here. Look, I think we have been euchred and brought into a battle defending that magazine, which is deeply anti-Islamic. It slurs the Prophet repeatedly, and instead of, you mentioned the First Amendment, fine, but I think if we are behind defending that, we're going to alienate every decent and moderate Muslim in the world who we want on our side in this war on terror.
But Pat, don't you think there's a rot in political Islam, that this is that there is this idea that we should not be equivocating on free speech. I'm with you. Some of the stuff they do is despicable, and it has to be across the board.
We got the right to free speech, but the question is, do you use it to insult the prophet?
But that's up to the individual, I think. It has to be up to the individual.
Well, finding that line between incitement and free speech is difficult, and in the case of this young man, he was a social misfit, kind of a loser. He's ranting and raving on Twitter. I'm glad the FBI is monitoring these sites because lots of dangerous things can come out of them. But then the FBI informant, suggests all this stuff to him, basically leads him to where he can find weapons, and then they swoop down and trap him. I agree, there's a major entrapment. I don't think Mr. Cornell poses a major
Even
threat
his father
to
called
this
him a
country.
mama's boy. Said he's a mama's boy, 20 years old. Now, Eleanor's point is well taken. There is now a rivalry between ISIS, which took command when it captured Mosul and a huge area of Syria and Iraq. Now Al-Qaeda has carried off, or claims to carry off, the major, really, terrorist incident since 9/11. The two of them are going to be competing for world attention in the Islamic world, and they're going to compete by who can kill more in a more dramatic way.
And what's so fascinating is it's very personal. Zarqawi, who was Osama bin Laden's successor, is now in a very personal fight, a religious fight, a political fight with Barghouti, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, with ISIS, who has proclaimed himself the emir of the believers. And so they're fighting for supremacy.
What do you think about the Belgian development?
Well, let me just say this. First, I want to go back to France for a second, okay? Because that was really an extraordinary statement on the part of the French and part of the people of that country, that freedom of speech and the freedom of the press was important. I mean, this wasn't the most important magazine in the country. And the fact is that the huge number, 2 million people showed up in Paris, another million in the countryside, to recognize it.
The next day they arrested 54 people for hate speech.
You know who didn't show up?
I mean, this is France.
That is an issue.
They're hypocrites.
There is hypocrisy
They went and
in
arrested
Europe.
this comedian, this Cameroonian comedian, who's famous over there for hate speech, after 4 million march for free speech.
It has to be free speech.
That's totally
What's your
mistaken.
point?
But it shows the effort to find the line between hate speech and free speech. I mean, we have issues in this country, and Europe has much tougher laws against hate speech than we have.
Who didn't show up in Paris?
The White House didn't have a high enough
president,
representative.
the vice president.
I think you've beaten that issue into the ground, John. The White House apologized. The French are happy. We're in a unified war against a very serious foe here.
If you're a unified war, that's why you do not use your freedom of speech to insult the prophet and the God of 1.6. You insult the prophet of Islam.
You engage, you show your you show that we stand up for our values. We
they're
don't
rioting in Pakistan today. They won't let the magazine.
They riot there all the time. And that's the rod of political Islam. That's not about us.
Okay, if you say the whole Islamic world is rotten, how are you going to win their hearts and minds?
I'm saying political Islam is rotten, that politicians use this as a whipping horse instead of engaging with issues like poverty, economics, social mobility.
You mean that's good
Hold on, please. Hold on. Let's get an alternate.
Needless provocation is really not necessary.
Let's get back to the question of the no-show of the president or the vice president in Paris.
They should have sent. They should have sent. I think the Secretary of State, who's very popular, and Bill Clinton.
And Bill Clinton. They should have.
They should have had some senior representative of this country at that particular ceremony, okay? Like it or not. You can justify it in any way you want. The whole world recognized that this was a huge mistake. This country also recognized it.
So does the White House. They've already apologized. What more do you want them to do?
I want them to be able to think about this in advance.
Well,
so that
why didn't they go?
Yes.
Because one, security concerns with the president, I think, are totally valid.
They go to Pakistan.
I wouldn't make that case with the vice president or anyone else. I think they underestimated the symbolism and the power of that moment. It was a moment, and they're now trying to capture it. They're having a White House summit on combating violent extremism.
Sure.
They're going to continue this conversation.
That's known as change the subject.
Right.
Well, it's also known as trying to find some solutions to all the online recruiting that is luring young people in cities and rural communities all over the world, from Detroit and Minnesota
And
to
Charlie Hebdo-
Paris and
Charlie
everywhere
Hebdo
else.
is recruiting them as well.
And,
that
and,
magazine
and
is.
Pat's made some legitimate comments about
Occasionally
Charlie
do that.
Hebdo.
Excuse me. Issue 2, Barack's India adventure.
Annual trade in goods and services between the United States and India has grown nearly fivefold since 2000 alone. Bilateral foreign direct investment now stands at nearly $30 billion. And our trade and investment supports hundreds of thousands of jobs in both of our countries.
Secretary of State John Kerry last week addressed a conference in India, a democracy the size of Western Europe, with a population of over 1,250,000,000 people. India's main exports are petroleum products, precious minerals, machinery, iron, and steel. India's estimated per capita GDP, gross domestic product, is $4,000. In contrast, American per capita is $52,800. These statistics matter because President Obama will visit India later this month, and it's a big deal. For the first time ever, India has invited an American president to be the prestigious guest of honor at its annual Republic Day parade. The U.S. Secret Service is gearing up. The press is reporting that President Obama will travel in the parade in his heavily armored limousine, as is the custom, side by side with the Indian president. India is the world's largest democracy, and it is now led by passionate economic reformer Prime Minister Narendra Modi. President Obama wants to be on the good side of what may become the world's next superpower. Secretary of State Kerry is a big believer in the future of Indian-American relations.
The fruits of this kind of partnership are extraordinary, and the supply chain for goods and services now stretches not just one country to another, but between many different countries. Here's the truth, and this is what is important at a meeting like this. We can do more together, and we must do more together, and we have to do it faster.
Question, should Americans be excited that President Obama is attending India's Republic Day parade? Is this a sign of a new special relationship? Mort Zuckerman.
Actually, it is. We've had deteriorated relations with India for quite a while, and this is a very important day for them, and that she is attending is an important event.
Yeah, I agree with that.
The other thing is that there is a rapport between President Obama and the leader of India, and that also is going to be very helpful. So they're a huge factor. They're a very important country for us. They're a huge manufacturer of all kinds of good things. They're an important ally, so I think it's very good that we have a healthy relationship.
It's a key part of the president's pivot to Asia as well. And the president really didn't pay enough attention to Asia during most of his presidency. He's making up for lost time. It also doesn't hurt that there is a growing Indian American population in this country. They're wealthy, they're politically engaged, and they're kind of up for grabs between the two parties. So there's some domestic political payoff for this, in addition to the economic fruits that John Kerry talked about.
You favor Americans being the home of wealthy people from other parts of the world? You like to have a lot of wealthy?
I like having lots of wealthy Americans, and I like having,
very
I'd
big
like
in
to see
Silicon
the
Valley.
wealth gap narrowed. I'm just pointing out that there are a lot of Indian Americans in this country, and they're doing very well, and they're a political prize.
You have something to say on this?
Yeah, I think it's a very important relationship for a lot of the reasons mentioned in terms of the economic relationship. I hope we need to get India more wealthy, which I think, Pat is going to be concerned about the globalization angle. But look, as India gets more wealthy, they will buy more American goods where we have a comparative economic advantage. The relationship is important for that reason. It's important because India is a major democracy, has issues in terms of class culture. But if we can resolve some of these, we can have a huge economic relationship and a huge strategic relationship, both in the Indian Ocean and again, with concerns about China and Russia. That's
he's
important.
trying to cut you off, but I'm not going to let him. What's the story on India's economy?
I think it's growing. Narendra Modi is trying to reform a former, essentially like a governor, and his economic reforms in terms of cutting the bureaucracy, opening up for foreign investment, reducing some subsidies is very important. We'll have to see what happens with that.
Well, the World Bank just issued new projections forecasting Europe to be near recession, Russia in a steep recession, Brazil dropping to about 1% growth, China dropping to about 7.1% growth, and India growing a respectable 6.4%. What do you make of that?
India's not in the league with China or Japan or Europe, John. What India wants is the United States. Basically, they're looking up north at China, which controls some of their territory. Chinese submarines are appearing in the Indian Ocean. They want the Americans brought in as a counterweight. We used to be aligned with Pakistan in the Cold War. Now I agree we ought to move close to India, sort of economically good relationship, but the idea of any kind of military alliance is out of the question, unwise and foolish.
Well, for one of your next columns is if the economic trends in India and China continue to grow at their present rate, India will outrank China.
No, it's going to be a long, long time. China's still growing at 7.5%, and by some standards, World Bank, they're equal to the United States.
Chinese growth is dropping and may fall below 7% next year. Meanwhile, just a moment, India's growth has risen to 6.4%. And if it accelerates again next year, India may soon be growing faster than China.
Well,
what do you think of that?
I think they're exaggerating about their economic growth. They have major wealth inequality between rural and urban areas and huge political pressures under the surface because of the absence of freedom and the power of the central state.
I have one final question on this, Eleanor. Which car will these two presidents ride in?
The president never travels in any car other than the one that comes from the White House.
Secret Service.
And if Modi doesn't travel in that one, he's going to travel in another car.
As good as the one.
It'll be the president's car.
Do you know anything about the president's car?
I've been in it.
What's it weight?
It's heavy as it can be. I've been on a plane where they flew it.
It's bulletproof and bomb-proof.
It is indestructible. Do you think Modi will be in the president's car?
The president of India. He's the prime minister.
Issue 3. The cyber wars.
When the McLaughlin Group first aired, there was no internet. We, the public, were still over a decade away from internet access. Today, the internet offers information that is almost infinite. Likewise, business and social opportunities on the net. But there's another side to the coin. In recent months, terms like cybercrime and cyber terrorism have gained ubiquitous media coverage. Whether the hacking of major corporations like Sony Pictures, or the effort by jihadists to recruit terrorists towards violence, or the schemes by organized criminals to steal personal information stored online, or to share illegal material beyond police investigators, humankind is learning that there's a dark side to the internet. So, late to the game, world leaders are trying to catch up with the internet. This week, British Prime Minister David Cameron met with President Obama to discuss internet crime. Prime Minister Cameron is particularly concerned that terrorists are using encrypted communications to evade intelligence monitoring. Here's what he said earlier this week.
In our country, do we want to allow a means of communication between people which, even in extremis, with a signed warrant from the Home Secretary personally, that we cannot read? Now, up until now, governments of this country have said no, we must not have such a means of communication. That is why, in extremis, it's been possible to read someone's letter. That is why, in extremis, it's been possible to listen in to someone's telephone call. That is why the same applies with mobile communications. Let me stress again, this cannot happen unless the Home Secretary personally signs a warrant. We have a better system for safeguarding this very intrusive power than probably any other country I can think of. But the question remains, are we going to allow a means of communication where it simply isn't possible to do that? And my answer to that question is no, we must not. The first duty of any government is to keep our country and our people safe.
Following their White House meeting on Friday, President Obama seemed to agree with the Prime Minister's sentiment.
Given the urgent and growing danger of cyber threats, we decided to expand our cooperation on cybersecurity to protect our critical infrastructure our businesses, and the privacy of our people.
Question, what concretely is President Obama doing to tighten cybersecurity? Tom Rogan.
Well, the first thing he was doing was speaking with Prime Minister Cameron on Friday.
What do you think of what Cameron had to say?
I think it's interesting because as much as they both agree about the nature of the threat, David Cameron, because of the nature of a more authoritarian government system in the UK, is willing to and wants to have much tougher powers for the government to be able to go and intercept things.
Do you think either exaggerated the threat?
No, I don't think they did. I disagree somewhat with Prime Minister Cameron because I think the tradition there in the UK of politicians being able to sign warrants is not a good one for the United States to copy. I also have concerns about some of the things the British government is doing in terms of restricting access to different platforms. But look, technology has to be compatible with intelligence gathering activities in a legal way. I think there's a middle line between what the president would be willing to accept and the prime minister.
Look,
That's
John,
very good. That's much better than some of his
Yeah,
explanations.
John, let me say that, look, Cameron made a very powerful, persuasive case that we ought to have a right to, in extremists, listen to phone calls, intercept emails, all the rest of it, he's right. But we live in a libertarian age, and I can tell you the desire of people to have their communications confidential is enormously powerful, and the ability to encrypt them, people are going to take advantage of it and use it, and I don't think he's going to be able to change that legally.
Well, we can tap phones, and that's done legally, and the internet is a new form of communication. There should be what they call a backdoor into monitoring some of these communications. And I think people get more upset when they think government is looking at what they're doing, but corporations and Facebook and Google and companies, every time you go online, they know where you've been and they're popping up ads that might attract you. So we're being watched. There's no such thing as pure privacy. With appropriate safeguards and oversight, the government should be allowed to monitor some of these sites that want to be encrypted and that don't want to let anybody in and might be up to some wrongdoing. So,
what do you think, Mark?
Look, I think it's not an unusual balance between personal liberties and the concern of the community. There are going to be times where the government says, in order to protect the community, we have to have access. And people say, well, we don't want you to have access. And
What do you do if they encrypt it?
They can
Put him in jail?
No, this is what he's looking for. That he's proposing a way to get in to get past the encryption.
Out of time. Bye-bye.